1943, and across the world, the Second World War rages on. In Europe, the state of Germany is at its territorial peak. The past 3 years were witness to some of the quickest and most impressive series of offensive military campaigns in modern history. Germany, her satellites and allies, Hungary, Romania, and Italy, have swallowed up or subjugated their European neighbors. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, Albania, and France. Germany's land forces have managed this largely due to the fact that they have fully embraced mechanization. Fast-moving tanks and motorized infantry, air support, recon, speed. It is such a revolutionary shift away from traditional trench warfare that it earns its own name: Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. But by 1943, the situation approaches a stalemate and begins to turn against the Axis powers. In the West, Germany is unable to single-handedly overcome the combined defensive efforts of the Royal Navy and the RAF. And despite tactical successes of her submarines in the North Atlantic, the English Channel and the waters of the Western world remain largely under British control. In the East, Germany's armies have become locked in a protracted land war with the Soviet Union. At one time, advanced units of the Wehrmacht were within mere miles of Moscow. With millions dying in the Battle of Stalingrad, Germany is forced for the first time to fight defensively. With her armies now unable to overcome this situation, Germany now seeks to exploit the one advantage it still has: technology, in the hopes that the development of so-called wonder weapons will one day overcome the logistical nightmare she finds herself in. In German-occupied Norway, heavy water plants are utilized as part of an initiative towards making the world's first atomic fission weapon. Under Operation Eisbar, Germany would deploy against England the world's first ever cruise missile, a flying drone known as the V-1. Powered by a pulse jet, it is able to deliver an 850-kilogram explosive warhead to civilian areas in the United Kingdom. Finally, a separate research program under Walter Dornberger had, throughout the 1930s, been developing a series of vertically launched, inertially guided ballistic missiles known as the aggregate rockets. By 1943, the Aggregate 4 design had proven itself capable enough for military use. Its production model would be called the V-2, and it would become the world's first weaponized launch vehicle. Over 3,000 V-2s would be launched against Allied targets, but several flights would occur outside of military use, primarily sponsored by the program's technical director and vehicle designer, 31-year-old Wernher von Braun. One such launch was vehicle MW-18-014, which was flown vertically throughout the entire ascent phase to maximize the vehicle's peak altitude. It achieved an apogee of 176 kilometers, or 109.3 miles above the surface of the Earth, becoming the first man-made object to reach outer space. None of these last-ditch efforts turned the tide for Nazi Germany. But the technologies that had been developed are hungrily eyed by the Allied intelligence agencies. And as the post-war world is carved into capitalist and communist spheres of influence, so too is the intelligentsia of the German military-industrial complex. Many of these projects, including the production of V-1 and V-2 weapons, employ slave labor drawn from the massive infrastructure of concentration camps built by Nazi Germany during the war. Complicit in the system that committed the 20th century's worst atrocities against humanity, the scientists and engineers that had developed these wonder weapons were now at the mercy of the Allies who now stood victorious. Many German scientists and military officials knew they stood a chance for a better life in the West, and as the end of the war in Europe closed in, purposefully sought surrender with British or American units. Von Braun and his team collected blueprints, manifests, and documents from the program before they could be destroyed by the SS, and hid them, to be used as bargaining chips for asylum with the Allies. By September of 1946, Operation Paperclip was in full swing. Over 1,200 German officials involved in wonder weapon projects were granted offers they couldn't refuse: asylum and work in the United States, in exchange for a full pardon of their involvement in World War II. In October, the Soviet Union commences a similar operation, in which 2,200 German specialists are rounded up and deported eastward for work inside the Iron Curtain. Both the United States and the Soviet Union would go to great lengths to protect the identities of their respective German personnel, in some cases even thwarting efforts to bring certain individuals to justice, including operations conducted by Mossad, the intelligence and special operations agency of a brand new country in the world, Israel. Deep inside the continental United States, tests are conducted on captured V-2s. It is a weapon system unlike anything America has ever seen.
Reaching a speed of 3,000 miles an hour, the rocket climbs vertically for 60 miles before beginning its descent. It's been known to reach England 5 minutes after launching from the Netherlands over 200 miles away.
Von Braun and his team are sent to Huntsville, Alabama, and between 1946 and 1951, 67 captured V-2s are fired from the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico as part of a U.S. Army initiative to develop vehicle-mobile long-range field rockets. Some of these V-2s are launched as part of Project Bumper, which tests a new concept developed by JPL called staging, the approach of stacking multiple rockets. The first stage delivers a certain amount of speed and altitude, at which point it runs out of fuel and is purposefully jettisoned. The upper stage, having been delivered to this point and still fully fueled, can ignite its own engine and proceed onward, now unencumbered by the mass of the first stage's heavy fuel tanks and large engine. Staging is the basic principle upon which modern launch vehicles continue to operate. The final two V-2s launched as part of Project Bumper utilize a brand new long-range testing facility on the Atlantic Ocean. Located in Florida, the Cape Canaveral Joint Long-Range Proving Ground allows the testing of larger, longer-range missile designs. Von Braun and his team developed the V-2 into the PGM-11 Redstone missile, capable of carrying the Ford Megaton W-39 nuclear warhead to a distance of 325 kilometers in the span of just 10 minutes. Like the V-2, liquid oxygen and an alcohol-water mixture are used as fuel. But with America's military primarily interested in high-speed aircraft, the development of missile technology stagnates. Von Braun, ever eager to continue pushing the outside of the envelope, publishes several articles in Collier's magazine, and even helps produce public awareness documentaries about the potential of spaceflight in conjunction with the Walt Disney Company.
Now here's a model, my design for a 4-stage orbital rocket ship. Compared to the unmanned instrument rocket, it is quite large, but the overall size and weight of the rocket is mainly determined by the 11 tons weight of this top section. This weight dictates the amount of fuel and the numbers of motors needed to produce enough power to equalize the gravitational pull of the Earth.
In 1952, the International Council of Scientific Unions, one of the world's oldest international bodies, announces that the 1957 to 1958 period of solar maximum, the peak of the 11-year-long solar cycle, would coincide with an international scientific project known as the Geophysical Year. This was an effort designed to promote healthy peacetime competition in the wake of the Cold War, and simultaneously promote global interest in Earth sciences. Not many in the US and USSR take the Geophysical Year seriously. But when, on March 5, 1953, the premier of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, dies, the ascension of Nikita Khrushchev that September opens the door for a slight thaw. By 1955, the Eisenhower administration announces that the United States would participate in the International Geophysical Year by attempting to launch the world's first Earth-circling satellite.
It is like nothing else so much, in my mind, as the radar room in a big battleship or some other complex thing that really is entirely beyond my comprehension, but is still capable of exciting my wonderment.
By then, it was well understood that at least on paper, a rocket sufficiently powerful enough could deliver a payload to an altitude above the atmosphere, and then push it to such a high speed so as to strike a perfect mathematical balance. The forward momentum of the object being so great as to equal the pull of Earth's gravity, achieving a state of gravitational limbo as the object's horizontal velocity causes it to constantly fall past the Earth, a state of permanent freefall, arcing over the horizon at 7,800 meters per second. Orbit. Once the object achieves this velocity in space, there is practically no air resistance to slow it down. This means achieving orbit at a sufficiently high altitude would allow large enough missiles to deliver vehicles and payloads into a relatively stable state. Once something enters orbit, it can continue to stay there for a significant amount of time without consuming any further propellant. This fact leads to a brand new concept in human knowledge: the artificial satellite. This is exactly the kind of opportunity von Braun had been hoping for. He gives a passionate pitch to the Eisenhower administration to let him and the Army ballistic missile team utilize a modified prototype Redstone missile called the Jupiter-C to launch the world's first satellite. American chemist Mary Sherman Morgan had, at the direction of von Braun, developed a new type of rocket fuel called Hydyne, a combination of 60% unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and 40% diethylnatriamine. This fuel, when burned with liquid oxygen, does not rise to the same temperature as alcohol, and therefore does not need to be cut with water. This improves the rocket's performance by 8%. And this modification, combined with small solid upper stages, would be enough to put a small mass into orbit. But von Braun is flatly rejected by the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower wants the world's first satellite to be put there by a rocket developed by Americans, not Germans. Also, the Jupiter-C's unavoidable relation to the Redstone field missile, and by extension, the V-2, could be interpreted as a militarization of space. There were just too many liabilities. The contract instead goes to the Navy, which develops the Vanguard launch vehicle. The extra time needed in developing a whole new rocket from the ground up concerns few in the United States. The Russians are obviously behind in rocket development, or so the Eisenhower administration had thought. In May of 1957, the Soviet Union tests a new missile of their own, the R-7 Semyorka. It is a massive rocket unlike any the world has ever witnessed, the brainchild of two geniuses, vehicle designer Sergei Korolev and lead engineer Valentin Glushko. Together with the Soviet team of German scientists, these two have made the world's first ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, capable of throwing a nuclear warhead over a distance of 5,000 miles, nearly 9,000 kilometers. No one in the West is given forewarning when, on October 4th, 1957, an R-7 Semyorka launches a 184-pound metal sphere with 4 antennas called Sputnik.
Man stands on the threshold of outer space. It's the biggest story of the year, possibly the #1 story of the century. This launching of the Russian satellite, which brings into the realm of possibility all those wild science fiction stories of interplanetary travel. Watch it. It's fascinating. This animation is a graphic portrayal of how a satellite operates. This story of the Russian satellite burst upon a startled world early in October. Russia announcing she had shot a man-made moon 560 miles into space, where it was circling the Earth at the dizzy speed of 18,000 miles per hour. It sent its familiar beep-beep back to Earth, was tracked by radio and by sight as it hurtled across the heavens.
The Soviet Union had beaten the United States in the International Geophysical Year's Earth Satellite Project. Literally overnight, the worldwide perception of power and technology shifts in Russia's favor for the first time in the Cold War. Many in the US see it as an all-out crisis. Anyone can tune into Sputnik's beeping as it passes over the continental United States, and people to this day still claim to have seen it with their own eyes. Sputnik's relatively tiny 58-centimeter diameter makes this highly improbable. What most people actually observe is the depleted core stage of the R-7 as it orbits alongside the small satellite. It is nearly 50 times bigger than the tiny metal ball. Less than a month later, on November 3rd, a second Soviet satellite, Sputnik 2, places the first living object in orbit, a stray mongrel from the streets of Moscow named Laika. That December, the Navy's Vanguard launch vehicle was ready, and America's official response to Sputnik had been cleared for liftoff. The press called it Kaputnik. It had been a double slap in the face for the Eisenhower administration, and the United States looked undeniably inept in the field of burgeoning rocket technology. Von Braun, who had already made his doubts clear about the Vanguard hardware, promises Eisenhower that with the green light, he can put an American satellite into orbit within 60 days. A desperate Eisenhower finally gives the go-ahead, and by February of 1958, von Braun places a JPL-designed satellite dubbed Explorer 1 atop a Jupiter C ballistic missile. This small satellite is packed with 4 science experiments, including instruments to measure micrometeorite impacts, acoustic detectors, temperature sensors, and an omnidirectional Geiger-Muller tube to measure proton and electron radiation. This suite of scientific instrumentation is put together by Dr. James Van Allen of the University of Iowa. February 1st, 1958. Explorer 1 takes off.
Some 3 minutes later, Explorer is in orbit, broadcasting to the world its coded scientific data. This close-up of the United States edition of Sputnik was made at a press conference with leaders of the scientific teams, Dr. Werner von Braun, Dr. James Van Allen, and Dr. William Pickering. A three-way collaboration between private industry, academic science, and the military. Cosmic ray intensity, meteor impact, solar radiation. These are the dry facts that will help carry man ever farther into the age of space.
Explorer 1 becomes America's first satellite in orbit. Its scientific instruments shed light on the existence of localized bands of radiation existing at high orbit altitudes, which soon become named the Van Allen belts. The International Geophysical Year, the public catalyst for which all of this was officially pursued, quickly becomes overshadowed and forgotten in the face of what soon becomes known as the space race, as both countries bolster their efforts to continue missile development. And with the launch of a dog aboard Sputnik 2, it was clear to many in the Eisenhower administration that human spaceflight was Russia's next obvious goal. The director of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, Hugh Dryden, makes the case for an American national research program to develop space technology, stating, "It is of great urgency and importance to our country, both from consideration of our prestige as a nation as well as military necessity, that this challenge of Sputnik be met by an energetic program of research and development for the conquest of space." The United States House of Representatives creates a select committee on astronautics and space exploration, which soon drafts what will become the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958. Signed into law by President Eisenhower, this federal statute abolishes the NACA, merging its responsibilities into a brand new, much larger, and more centralized agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA is born. This new member of the executive branch is charged with several objectives, but the first three are the most important. 1. The expansion of human knowledge of phenomena in the atmosphere and space. 2. The improvement of the usefulness, performance, speed, safety, and efficiency of aeronautical and space vehicles. 3. The development and operation of said vehicles capable of carrying instruments, equipment, supplies, and living organisms through space. NASA's holistic purpose is to bring the various isolated aeronautical development programs scattered across the U.S. together under a single federal umbrella, in order to avoid the unnecessary duplication or competition of American effort, facilities, and equipment. It is one of the largest centralizations of American government in the 1950s. Setting policy and direction for this new agency would be the National Aeronautics and Space Council, a collection of individuals from the highest echelons of government and aerospace research. Chaired by the President himself, other members would include the Secretaries of State and Defense, the Chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and the newly appointed Administrator of NASA, Thomas Keith Glennan. Glennan presides over an organization that had absorbed the earlier NACA, its 8,000 employees, an annual budget of $100 million, nearly $880 million in today's money, and 3 major laboratories. The Langley Aeronautical Lab, now the Langley Research Center, located on the Chesapeake Bay in Hampton, Virginia. The Ames Research Center at Moffett Federal Airfield in what is now Silicon Valley. And finally, the Lewis Flight Research Center, located in Brook Park, Ohio. Over the next 2 years, Glennan would oversee the absorption of further laboratories and research centers. By 1960, NASA would assume responsibility of several programs that started as Army, Navy, Air Force, or DoD projects. This includes such offices as DARPA and JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. NASA quickly balloons into a big tent agency, assuming responsibility for and sharing information between the various existing laboratories nationwide, as well as constructing new ones, such as the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. The most pressing and imminent issue that now faces this new agency is manned spaceflight. NASA's first priority: put a man into space before the Soviet Union. To this end, Glennan organizes a cabal of senior engineers, an aggregate of talent and knowledge pooled from the various laboratories across the country. This collection of 45 are known as the Space Task Group. It is up to them to decide precisely how America will launch the world's first astronaut. The leader of the Space Task Group is Robert Gilruth, who, before NASA, was working on hypersonic missiles at the NACA. Other notable members include Chris Kraft and Glenn Lunny. Although not part of the original 45, more notable members would join in the next 2 years, the most famous being a 27-year-old Gene Kranz. Notably absent from this group, Werner von Braun.
I reported to the Langley Research Center. I was never interviewed for the job. Sat in basically a bullpen for about 2 weeks. And a gentleman comes up, taps me in the shoulder and says, "I'm Chris Kraft, you're working for me now. I want you to go down to the Cape, write a countdown, write some mission rules, and when you're through, give me a call and we'll launch." I could put the piece together. I knew there had to be a spacecraft, and that's over at Hangar S, and you go down the launch pad, there's a booster down there. I knew a bit about range safety from Holloman, where we were, so I could go over and find range safety. So there's a question of pulling these people together.
The most influential member of this group is mechanical engineer Max Faget. His research leads him to the work of one Harry Julian Allen, who in 1952 was testing various types of shapes for warheads at hypersonic flight. His tests led to the formulation of the blunt body principle. Of the 3 possible methods of returning to Earth from space, those being ballistic, skip, and glide, he came to the conclusion that a blunt, non-lifting, high-drag projectile-like vehicle was both the simplest to design and most reliable to control. This radical departure from the streamlined aircraft approach, such as the X-15, is based on the fact that a blunt body would produce an extremely large disturbance in the atmosphere, known as a bow shock, which could carry away up to 90% of the friction heat generated by the hypersonic speed. While deceleration g-forces would be high, on paper, the ballistic vehicle was a practical, man-carrying machine. All that would be required was to develop a material that could somehow protect the interior of the craft from the remaining 10% of entry heat. Instead of opting for a heat sink, Faget and the designers choose an ablative heat shield. Layers of fiberglass cloth and phenolic resin that would physically burn away at a controlled rate, exchanging mass for heat, and transferring said heat away from the vehicle. The blunt shape would require the least amount of testing, since it was already physically represented by the nuclear warheads which the rockets have already been designed to carry. By January 1959, America's first spacecraft had taken shape, and the contract was awarded to the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation to build these bold new machines that would grant humans access to the great beyond. Also, this centralized campaign of putting a man in space now had an official name, one that would represent the speed, skill, and cunning required to make it happen. It would be named after the Roman god of travelers and luck, Project Mercury. But now came the decision of who. Who among the American people would be chosen to fly as our first ambassadors to space? It would have to be a group of people pulled from an industry that hardened them to danger and high-stress situations. They would need to be able to make quick and clear judgments under physical duress. They would need to be able to perform familiar tasks in an unfamiliar environment, in a vehicle that may be spinning, upside down, and tumbling. Stock car drivers, acrobats, and daredevils are initially considered for the job. But at the insistence of the Eisenhower administration, a more disciplined and educated pool of talent is chosen: military test pilots. This decision would have a huge effect on the coming development of not only the Mercury capsule, but all future American manned spacecraft. It would also mean that NASA would be recruiting from the military, specifically educated pilots familiarized with high-speed jet aircraft, an occupation which, at the time, is dominated entirely by men. 508 volunteers are approved for initial screenings. Through the early months of 1959, this group is whittled down to just 32, who make it to physical trials. The physical evaluation program is carried out for NASA by the Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Each candidate spends 7.5 days and 3 evenings at the facility, where they are subjected to the most rigorous physical examinations in the history of modern medicine. The vision testing alone includes refraction, visual fields, extraocular muscle balance, red lens tests, tonometry, depth perception, slit lamp testing, dark adaptation, dynamic visual acuity, and color perception. Their hearing is also subjected to a battery of tests, and beyond that, electrocardiograms, ballistocardiograms, tilt table tests, lung capacity tests, neurological examinations, and even a proctosigmoidoscopy. Each candidate gives blood, stool, and semen, and is measured for blood count, hematology smear, hemoglobin, hematocrit, sedimentation rate, fasting blood sugar, cholesterol, blood grouping, sodium, potassium, carbon dioxide, chloride, urea clearance in blood and urine, blood urea nitrogen, protein-bound iodine, protein electrophoresis, blood volume, total body water, ketosteroids, throat cultures, and sperm count. The tests were exhausting and, in retrospect, largely useless and overthought. Nonetheless, by using the entire group's average as a baseline, out of 32 finalists, only 7 emerge. A few months later, a second, privately funded medical study performed the same battery of tests on a group of female pilots recruited through a pilots' organization known as the 99s. In the end, 13 women passed the same physical examinations that the Lovelace Foundation had developed for the astronaut selection process. The experiment was a success. Though these women are physically capable of becoming astronauts, NASA already has their pilots. 7 men, a contingent of mature Americans, average in build and visage. Family men all, college-educated as engineers, possessing excellent health and professionally committed to flying advanced aircraft. Though short of average in height, they were all above average in competitiveness and seriousness of purpose. They were NASA's first astronaut group.
When you have a brand strange new machine, then you go to the test pilots. That's what they were trained to do, and that's what they had been doing. Now, of course, NACA had some test pilots, but they were a little bit older. None of them, I don't think, were in a position where they probably could have competed with the varied background of test flying, which most of us had.
Today we are introducing to you and to the world these 7 men who have been selected to begin training for orbital space flight. It's my pleasure to introduce to you, and I consider it a very real honor, gentlemen, Malcolm S. Carpenter,
Scott Carpenter,
Leroy G. Cooper,
Gordon Cooper, known as Gordo,
John H. Glenn,
John Glenn,
Virgil I. Grissom,
Virgil Grissom, known as Gus,
Walter M. Shira,
Walter Schirra, known as Wally,
Alan B. Shepard,
Alan B. Shepard, known as Al,
Donald K. Slayton,
and Donald Kent Slayton, known as Deke.
These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
While, at least theoretically, the tests and examinations they underwent declared them prepared for spaceflight, nothing could prepare these 7 men for the torrent of celebrity in which they will find themselves now submerged. Unlike the Soviet Union's effort, the United States announces her plans to the world, and despite doing little more than having been selected to one day fly into space, the Mercury 7 are instantly dubbed heroes by the American media. Confidence is at an all-time high.
But yet, all of a sudden realizing that here was competition. There were 7 guys competing for the first job, or whatever that turned out to be. 7 guys going for that one job. So on the one hand, there was a sense of friendliness and maybe in some support, but on the other hand, hey, I hope the rest of you guys are happy because I'm going to make the first flight.
Certainly some of the tests we had out there were the most trying,
And it's rather difficult to pick one because if you figure how many openings there are on the human body and how far you can go in any one of them.
You gave it away.
Now you answer which one would be the toughest for you.
And it was the inspiration was really a challenge to sit down and say, we will put this together and we're going to win this battle for the high ground. And that's what my mission became.
Amongst the sun-kissed beaches of Florida, a cultural dichotomy emerges. Being chosen as NASA's official launch site into space, the Cape Canaveral Joint Long-Range Proving Ground sees an influx of talent in the form of American aeronautical technicians, private contractors, German rocket engineers. Titusville, Florida becomes a boomtown, and the bars and hotels which regularly host tanned beachgoers and young adults also begin to see the traffic of pasty, high-strung missile men and exhausted Space Task Group controllers. NASA now just needs to test the hardware to a point where it has demonstrated an acceptable level of safety and reliability.
Kraft wanted each one of us, he trusted each one of us to basically accomplish our role during the course of the mission, but he wasn't looking for clones. He wanted to look for people who were not only capable of leadership, but basically addressing the challenge every step forward as he moved into space.
But I remember there was the Cold War, there was the competition. It was obviously their objectives, their capabilities for orbital flight were greater than ours at that particular point.
Basically witnessed firsthand the impact upon the young people that were in the mission control team. I had lost a couple of pilots in my squadron when we were over in Korea. Kraft had worked flight test, he was familiar with accidents, and it was really a question of carrying this young group of people through very traumatic.
The astronauts finally start familiarizing themselves with the new Mercury capsule, the spacecraft that will one day be carrying them into orbit. and they do not like what they see. So far, the designers are largely leaving pilot input and control out of the picture. They are moving the spacecraft's design towards a more automated approach. America's Mercury astronauts strongly protest this direction, knowing it would make them little more than spam in a can, simply along for the ride. As a collective group, they begin to successfully lobby NASA management and contractors, surrendering some of the capsule's automation in favor of a more human-oriented layout, with the astronaut pilot able to take manual control of the spacecraft and have access to all the capsule's fuel systems. A big point of contention comes when the astronauts ask for a window through which to look out. A glass window and the added structure required to support it would add both weight to the final design and time in verifying that the capsule was ready to fly. While it does delay the program, the astronauts ultimately get their wish, threatening to go public if their voices aren't heard. November 21st, 1960. Mercury Redstone 1, an unmanned test flight, bringing together all the newly developed hardware aspects of the fledgling manned program. The new Mercury capsule mated to the new Redstone rocket, both flying together into space. It was called the 4-inch flight. The failure of ground cables to separate in the correct sequence caused an erroneous electrical signal to initiate the escape tower to fire, something which isn't supposed to happen until the rocket has depleted all of its propellant. For the upcoming manned spaceflights, the Mercury capsule sits underneath a protruding spike known as the Launch Escape Tower. This is, essentially, a powerful solid rocket booster with a high thrust-to-weight ratio, able to overcome that of the launch vehicle during the early phases of powered flight. The Launch Escape Tower is able to physically overcome the thrust of the booster and pull the capsule away from the rocket during the period of time in which it is still traversing Earth's atmosphere and more susceptible to failure. It is an ejection seat for the entire spacecraft, an option of last resort. The tower automatically ejects when the onboard computer senses that the rocket is out of fuel. This flight represents an embarrassing failure of the best laid plans. 1 month later, a second attempt, Mercury Redstone 1A, is flawless. There is considerable pressure to launch the first astronaut into space, but also considerable worry about the standards of the Redstone launch vehicle, which had demonstrated considerable reliability and control issues. NASA, operating cautiously and conservatively, decided that the next flight, Mercury Redstone 2, would be manned, but not by a human. A 3.5-year-old Cameroon chimpanzee named Ham will be flying into space aboard this Mercury capsule. It is a controversial decision, to say the least. Many wonder why send humans into space at all if they are not to be first. Some lampoon the astronauts as having little more importance than the chimps themselves. Ham's capsule sees the implementation of several systems not flown previously, including a pneumatic landing bag to be deployed underneath the heat shield after re-entry, live retro rockets, and voice communication. During the launch, the Redstone rocket drifts off course by a single degree. This high flight angle causes Ham's re-entry to be much steeper. Ham sustains not 11.5 Gs of deceleration, but nearly 15. The Redstone can lob the Mercury capsule well into space, but not even closely into orbit. The suborbital trajectory is much like the arc of a mortar shell or cannonball, up and down, with a peak altitude and around 6 minutes of weightlessness. Ham splashes down 60 miles away from the nearest recovery ship, and by the time rescue helicopters arrive, the spacecraft is already on its side, taking on water and submerging. The beryllium heat shield had bounced hard against the capsule and punctured 2 holes in the titanium pressure bulkhead. When the helicopter crew finally latched onto the capsule, it was estimated that it had taken on nearly 800 pounds of water. Ham is tired, scared, and dehydrated, but overall in good shape. He readily eats an apple and half an orange after the flight. All eyes are now on NASA, as it is clear that the next flight to leave Cape Canaveral will carry a human. But there is still significant worry and apprehension. No one on the ground wants to give the final go. January 20th, 1961. Democrat John Fitzgerald Kennedy is inaugurated the 35th President of the United States of America. He vows to aggressively continue and expand America's exploration of the new frontier of space. Unlike Eisenhower, the Kennedy administration does not think twice about Wernher von Braun's background and connection with the Third Reich. With Kennedy in office, von Braun can now expect increased political support from above.
The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands, unleashed by science, the power to abolish all forms of human life. The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage. Together let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depth, and encourage the arts and commerce. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
The decision to redesign the spacecraft to be more user-friendly and less automated, the failure of Mercury Redstone 1, the decision to send a chimpanzee into space on Mercury Redstone 2, and the final apprehension for Mercury Redstone 3. These are all things that may have served a critical role in making the end product safer and more reliable, but they also had the effect of delaying the program again and again. If any one of these events had turned out differently, it may very well have been possible that the United States would send the first human into space. But as fate would have it, April 12, 1961 would not be a victory for the United States, but yet another stunning and embarrassing defeat. Fighter pilot and cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin is blasted into space aboard a modified R-7 in a spacecraft known as Vostok.
Man had his first great success in space when the Russians pushed a man across the threshold. He was Yuri Gagarin, the astronaut the Russians lionized as the first to orbit the Earth. It was the propaganda coup of the year. The space pilot, whom the Russians have deified as the man of the century, arrives at the airport outside of Moscow for his first public appearance. Questions that have arisen in the West about the validity of his flight have no place here today, as the crowds go wild over the first man to conquer space. Major Gagarin's initial function is a long...
The Vostok spacecraft is inferior to the Mercury capsule. It is primitive, heavy, and uncontrolled. The cosmonaut inside is largely just along for the ride. The spherical capsule means the spacecraft tumbles during the fiery descent to Earth. It couldn't even land safely. The occupant inside has to eject after re-entry and parachute to the ground. But it was good enough. Good enough to work. Good enough to be first. Not only is Yuri Gagarin first into space, The R-7 rocket is sufficiently powerful enough to blast the Vostok capsule into orbit as well, something the Redstone cannot do for the Mercury capsule. The Soviet Union benefits from the prodigal talent of a few key individuals working within its space program, none more so than Sergei Korolev. His knowledge and practical ability allows the Soviet Union to develop launch vehicle engines that are leaps and bounds ahead of those of the United States. It is once again made clear that the Soviet Union would be able to maintain its lead over the US for the foreseeable future. It had been an embarrassment to say the least, as the United States, by now, had been gearing up for manned spaceflight quite publicly for a long time. Just a week prior to the first manned American launch, NASA conducts another unmanned test of the new Atlas booster, which may one day in the future propel Mercury capsules into orbit. Mercury Redstone 3, the first American manned spaceflight, would have to fly in the shroud of yet another failure. Nobody knows who NASA has chosen at this point to be the first American to fly into space. The launch is scheduled for May 2nd, 1961. At midnight, the weather around the Cape worsened. Lightning and rain plagues the Cape all morning, and by 7:25, when the clouds give no sign of clearing, the launch is canceled. The astronaut for the first manned American space mission frustratedly walks out of the hangar and starts shimmying out of his spacesuit. A lurking reporter spots him and breaks the story. It's Al Shepard. The secret is now out. Hard-charging Alan B. Shepard Jr. was number one in line for the first U.S. flight into space. His mission, Mercury Redstone 3, is delayed 3 days. Everyone holds their breath and waits for the weather to improve. The leak of Al Shepard as the prime pilot for MR3 has the effect of drawing even more press coverage and national attention to an event which already captivates the nation. On May 5th, 1961, the weather report comes in. The skies will be clear. The mission is a go. The Redstone rocket sitting on the pad will blast Shepard's 2-ton capsule, nicknamed Freedom 7, on a 15-minute foray into space. A manned recreation of the flight undertaken by Ham the chimpanzee just a month prior. Like Ham, Al Shepard will experience upwards of a crushing 11 Gs on the steep downward re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. His short flight will be full of activity. The moment the capsule separates from the Redstone booster, Shepard will attempt to take manual control. He will test the spacecraft's ability to maneuver to various arbitrary attitudes with the hydrogen peroxide reaction control system jets, and then position it for retrofire. Strapped to the bottom of the heat shield is a small package containing 3 ripple-firing solid rockets. The package as a whole produces 526 kilograms of thrust for a sustained 10 seconds. It means little on this flight, but for the upcoming orbital flights, this retro pack is essential in slowing the spacecraft down just enough to dip it into the atmosphere and initiate re-entry. The Mercury capsule itself has no primary engines. It relies entirely on this retro pack, which is jettisoned prior to re-entry, to facilitate retrofire. The retro pack imparts a delta V of just 560 kilometers per hour, next to nothing in the extreme speeds of spaceflight. Alan's capsule, Freedom 7, is the last of the Mercury capsules without a forward-facing pilot's window. He will only be able to look outside through a small porthole on his side and through an onboard periscope. But on this short 15-minute flight, there won't be much looking at all. Shepard enters the spacecraft at 5:15 a.m. He has consumed 3 cups of coffee, a glass of orange juice, and a meal of steak and eggs with toast. Just 15 minutes prior to the scheduled launch time at 7:05, the launch is delayed for an hour to let residual cloud cover clear and to fix a power supply unit. An hour later, the count resumes, and then pauses yet again as another hold is called to reboot a computer at the Goddard Space Flight Center. All of these delays result in Shepard lying on his back inside the capsule for nearly 5 hours. Al is getting frustrated. What's worse, he severely needs to urinate.
Roger. All Mercury station, stand by for status report at T-minus 5.
7, Capcom, you read Jeff, how do you read?
7, rating it loud and clear, Capcom, over to Chase.
It's Chase 2.
Chase 2.
TM Blockhouse, what are your camera and tape recorders this time?
They're on. What is that?
Okay, if you would like to, I'll get an estimate on this.
This triggers a huge argument in the blockhouse. It could short out medical electrodes on his body. Shepard, never one to lose command of the situation, simply orders the engineers to turn the power off. They comply, and Shepard empties his bladder into the suit.
62 newsmen from 12 foreign countries are present. Some face about, some sit ramrod straight, staring at the launching pad where the redstone sits. A squawk box just announced, T-minus 6 minutes and counting. This is Charles von Fremd at the press site.
Assuming that everything goes according to plan, the spacecraft carrying astronaut Alan Shepard will land in the water somewhere near our position, almost 300 miles out in the Atlantic, east-southeast of Cape Canaveral. 3 Marine Corps helicopters are going into the air, along with half a dozen shore-based Navy and Air Force tracking planes that are up there. The planes will home in on the astronaut with the help of radar and the spacecraft's own radio transmitter. As hoped, the primary recovery helicopter will swoop in to pick up the capsule. In that primary helicopter, number 44, are only 2 persons, Marine pilot First Lieutenant Wayne Coons of Lyons, Kansas, and co-pilot George Cox of Eustis, Florida. Cox aided in the recovery of the MR2 capsule in January, got Ham the Chimp safely aboard a Navy ship. No
4 minutes on counting.
T-minus 4. Landed on the carrier flight deck, and 2 doctors especially trained by the Space Administration will begin debriefing him. We'll describe that recovery for you as it happens. This is Robert Lodge aboard the carrier Lake Champlain.
Just past 9:30 in the morning, the countdown gets below 5 minutes. After all this effort, all this time, America was finally ready to go. Most people involved are rightfully scared, naturally distrustful of the hardware they had toiled so long to develop. None are more excited or ready to fly than Alan Shepard.
Bridge power jettisoned. Astronaut A-OK.
Periscope is
Coming out.
out. And the turnaround has started.
Turnaround started, assuming orbital attitude.
SCS is okay. Control movements.
He's going to hand control movements now. Trajectory looks A-OK.
It is okay. On the periscope. What a beautiful view.
What a beautiful view.
Clouds cover over Florida. 3 to 4/10 near the eastern coast. Obscures up through Hatteras. You can see Okeechobee. Identify Andros
3
Island.
to 4/10 cloud cover along
Identify
the
the
eastern
reef.
coast of the United States, obscuring the eastern coast up through Cape Hatteras.
Retro, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Start retro sequence. In retro attitude,
Pilot
arc range.
reports assuming retro attitude, initiating retro fire sequence.
Control is smooth.
Pilot reports mission very smooth.
Retro 1,
Rocket number 1 has fired.
very smooth. Retro 2,
Retro number 2 has fired.
Retro 3,
Retro number 3 has fired.
all 3 retros are fired. Okay, 3 retros are fired. Retro jettison is back to arm.
Preparing to jettison
negative.
the pod. The retro rocket packet has jettisoned. The retro rocket
I
packet
do not have a light. I see the straps falling away. I heard a noise. I will use override. Override used. The light is green. Back to the
The spacecraft is beginning to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. We have a registration in the control center indicating 500 of a G, indicating the beginning of penetration.
Okay, it's fan 7. G build up.
We
3,
are still in voice communication with the pilot.
9.
9G coming down.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Going to PG now. He is still talking, saying, okay.
Okay. This is 7. Okay. $45,000 feet now.
Is excellent.
40,000 feet. Main tube is green. Main tube is coming unrated and it looks good. Main tube is good. The rate of descent is reading about 35 feet per second.
Communication with Bridger astronaut Alan Shepard is getting a little
Red
and white parachute. Now coming down. Alan B. Shepard reports he is at 7
miles directly in front of the carrier as we steam towards him. We have
Coming in
3
for landing.
helicopters in the air, headed towards the point where he is expected to hit the water.
The entire flight lasts 15 minutes and 22 seconds. Shepard is weightless for a third of that time, though there is no room to float inside the tight Mercury capsule. It is a blur of noise and motion, an event long anticipated that is over far too soon. The flight of Freedom 7 is a complete success. Shepard is instantly celebrated as a national hero and awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Kennedy. Kennedy drops the medal during the ceremony, but is quick to save the moment with a witty quip.
The members of the House and Senate Space Committee who are with us today, and this decoration, which has gone from the ground up here.
On May 25th, just a couple weeks after Shepard's flight, Kennedy addresses a joint special session of Congress. Kennedy wants to decisively beat the Russians in the field of manned spaceflight, but he knows that identifying a short-term goal, such as a space station, would likely cause America to lose, seeing as the Russians were already ahead. What he needs now is to lay out an objective so bold, so ambitious, it would take either country a decade or more to achieve. A period of time in which Kennedy is confident the United States can catch up to and surpass the Soviet Union.
We are to win the battle that is now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny. The dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
With a total of just 15 minutes of manned spaceflight experience, Kennedy pledges the resources of NASA and the United States towards landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Overnight, Wernher von Braun's wildest dreams come true. Apollo is greenlit and approved by Kennedy and the Congress. America is going to the moon. But before anyone is ready to make giant leaps, there are dozens of small steps that still need to be taken, including proving that Freedom 7 was no fluke. July 21st, 1961. Gus Grissom, aboard his Mercury capsule, Liberty Bell 7, a second suborbital hop into space on the Redstone.
Drop. Ignition. Liftoff.
Roger, this is Liberty Bell 7. The clock is operating.
Loud and clear, Jose. Don't cry too much.
Okie doke. Okay, it's a nice ride up to now.
Loud and clear.
Roger. Okay, the fuel is go, about 1 1/4 G's. Cabin pressure is just coming off the peg. The oxygen is go with 26 amps.
Roger, pitch AA, trajectory is good.
Roger, looks good here. Everything is good. Cabin pressure's holding, seat pressure's okay. 2 minutes and we got 4 G's. Fuel is go. Feel the hand controller move just a hair there. Cabin pressure's holding. Oxygen is go at 25 amps.
Roger, we are go here. Stand by for cutoff.
There with the tower?
Yeah, waiting on the tower.
Roger.
Grissom's capsule is the first with a forward-facing window. He is blasted to a height of 102 nautical miles and lands downrange in the Atlantic 15 minutes and 30 seconds after launch. The capsule splashes down in the ocean. Grissom removes his oxygen hose and opens his visor. Liberty Bell 7 is rolling badly in the swells. Grissom instructs the helicopter pilots to wait 5 minutes before coming to pick him up, as he begins recording his cockpit panel data with a grease pencil. He removes the pin from the hatch cover detonator and leans back, minding his own business as he rests and waits for the helicopters to retrieve the capsule. All of a sudden, there's an explosion. The explosive bolts surrounding the hatch cover detonate and it flies off, striking the water 1.5 meters away and skipping over the waves. A panicked Grissom climbs out and swims away from the spacecraft. The helicopter pilot knows that Grissom's suit can float, so he ignores Grissom and attempts to recover Liberty Bell 7, which is rapidly taking on water. The Sikorsky H-34 helicopter struggles to lift the capsule, which at this point is completely saturated. The pilot raises the collective to maximum and fights against gravity. Suddenly, a warning light illuminates inside the helicopter. Metal chips are being detected in the oil sump. The engine is being pushed to the breaking point. Simultaneously, in the water, Gus Grissom realizes he isn't riding as high as he was 5 minutes ago. He realized then that he forgot to secure his suit inlet valve. His spacesuit is taking on water, and fast. The entire event is being televised to Mercury Control. Flight controllers stare helplessly as they watch Gus start to flounder in the waves as the helicopter struggles with the capsule. Things are coming to a head. Gus is now barely above water. The pilot of the first helicopter, James Lewis, abandons the attempt to recover the spacecraft. Liberty Bell 7 sinks in 5.1 kilometers or 3.2 miles of water. Lewis flies away, realizing the implication of engine failure. Finally, a second helicopter moves in for Gus, piloted by George Cox. Gus had been saved, but Liberty Bell 7 was lost. Substantial controversy ensued, as Grissom reported that the hatch had blown without his authorization. An independent technical review raises doubts over this theory, but the most widely accepted explanation is that the hatch's external release lanyard, which was held in place by only one screw, came loose at splashdown. This is supported by further testing, which showed that the kickback from the manual trigger left a visible bruise, something which Grissom did not have. Either way, Liberty Bell 7 was a close call, but succeeded in its primary goal to prove the Mercury capsule was robust and could work reliably. The capsule would actually be recovered on July 20th, 1999, after 38 years on the seafloor. A little banged up, but amazingly no worse for wear. It currently rests at the Cosmosphere, a space museum in Hutchinson, Kansas.
Committed to doing the job well, to doing it safely. They value the lives of the astronauts, and you have to put yourself in a position of being responsible for lives every day, and that's not easily done. You can't walk away from that.
With 2 suborbital missions under their belt, it's time for NASA to raise the stakes. By this point, the Soviet Union had orbited 2 men. In order for the Mercury capsule to reach orbit, it would have to go more than 3 times faster. To accomplish this, NASA needs a lot more rocket. The answer? Upgrade the Mercury capsule's launch vehicle from the Redstone Army field missile to the Convair SM-65 Atlas ICBM. America's answer to the R-7 Semyorka. The Atlas launch vehicle is unique in several ways. The nature of its construction compensates for the weaknesses that are unique to American rockets in the early 1960s. The primary weakness when contrasted with Soviet missiles are rocket engines. American liquid rocket motor ignition reliability is less than 50%. As such, the Atlas is designed in such a way that all of its engines are ignited on the ground. No engines have to be lit in flight. It accomplishes this with an unprecedented stage-and-a-half concept. At launch, the Atlas sports an impressive 3 live engines, providing a maximum thrust-to-weight ratio when the vehicle is at its heaviest. A couple of minutes into flight, once the vehicle is in space and having depleted a lion's share of its fuel and mass, the outer 2 engines, called the booster engines, are jettisoned from the vehicle via a connected shroud. This event is known as BECO, or Booster Engine Cutoff. The center engine, called the Sustainer, continues burning until the entire rocket and its payload is in low Earth orbit. Also unique to the Atlas is its structure. There is no interior skeleton or physical support beams. The rocket utilizes a style of propellant storage called a balloon tank. It is made of very thin stainless steel, less than a millimeter thick. Just after construction, the tanks are inflated with nitrogen to give them their shape and strength. Balloon tanks must always remain pressurized. Any appreciable drop in internal pressure will result in structural failure. It is the internal pressure which makes the tanks rigid and strong, much like a soda can before it has been opened. This has the advantage of giving the Atlas an incredibly light, dry weight. The rocket itself weighs very little compared to its fuel, which helps performance and efficiency. Innovative and sometimes dangerous solutions such as these were the necessary workarounds required to maintain the competitive edge in the spaceflight arena. November 29th, 1961. NASA decides, yet again, to send a chimpanzee first. Enos the chimp is first to ride a Mercury capsule into orbit. Enos makes 2 orbits and is recovered in the Atlantic. The issues encountered are minor: temperature control problems and stuck thrusters, things which could be addressed with the presence of a human astronaut. The Atlas rocket has a long history of flight test failures. Nonetheless, it is the only means by which the Mercury capsule can enter Earth orbit. The next manned flight, Mercury Atlas 6, is given to who is perceived as the strongest and most resilient of the 7 astronauts, former Marine John Glenn. Glenn's mission, Friendship 7, will be a gargantuan leap compared to the suborbital hops of Shepard and Grissom. Glenn will be traveling over the Earth's surface at 17,500 miles an hour, nearly 8 kilometers a second. Nobody on the ground knows how the human body will respond to prolonged periods of zero-G. A global myriad of tracking stations called the Manned Spaceflight Network will be supporting Glenn's flight. As his spacecraft drifts between cells of coverage located in Goldstone, California, Bermuda, the Canary Islands, Nigeria, several ships in the Indian Ocean, Woomera, Australia, ships in the Pacific Ocean, and Hawaii. Low Earth orbit missions are only visible to a small fraction of the Earth's surface at one time, and due to their extreme speed, a large number of tracking stations spread all over the world is necessary just to provide communication for a fraction of the spacecraft's total orbit. After 10 postponements and 82 days of delays, Friendship 7 enters the terminal phase of its countdown in February of 1962. Further delays occur when a faulty component in the rocket's guidance system is discovered, and when the pad crew breaks a bolt in the spacecraft hatch and has to scurry off to get a new one. Every second of Glenn's flight has been calculated and recalculated on the ground with the day's most advanced digital computers. In 1962, computers and electronics in general are widely distrusted and unreliable. As such, human engineers and mathematicians crunch the numbers themselves, ensuring that the computers are spitting out the right results. The launch window, the rotation of the Earth under the orbit, the movement of the spacecraft as a function of speed and altitude, the landing site, where to send the recovery forces, the effect of atmospheric drag as a function of spacecraft weight. Every possible factor and alternative are predicted and planned ahead of time. In the days leading up to the launch, when a possible discrepancy is found in the orbital calculations, Glenn tells NASA engineers to, quote, get the girl to check the numbers. Glenn is referring to human computer Katherine Johnson, whose expertise and talent in this area is known to many in Project Mercury. February 20th, 1962. With millions watching on live TV, John Glenn prepares to ride the Atlas into orbit for the first time.
When the final Atlas engine will shut down, when Friendship 7 should separate from the booster rocket and begin orbital flight.
I wanted to say something like a bon voyage, buddy, have a good time, and also enlist the aid of our maker in protecting him.
Right all the way. You've got speed, John Glenn. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, ignition, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. Operating. Underway. Roger. Reading you loud and clear. License is ready. And this is 1447. Out here. That's clear. Sailing station. Right. 20 is still green. Roger. Clock looks good, flight. Roger. Roger. We're go. How about systems? Systems is go. Range safety still green. Fuel 102, 101, oxygen 78, 100 amps 27. Roger, loud and clear. Programming right down the line.
Miles and speed 17,500 miles an hour for a planned space flight that will take Colonel John Glenn around the world in 90 minutes. Trajectory A-OK, reports Mercury Control. History perhaps being written at this moment here at Cape Canaveral as Project Mercury reaches a climax with its launching operation. And now, 1 minute out, about 10 miles high, speed beginning to pick up into the thousands of miles an hour range in
High speed has passed through the area of maximum dynamic pressures. Pilot John Glenn is reporting all systems go. Is giving route to
Roger, Pico. Sector 1 1/4, the tower fired. Could not see the tower go. I saw the smoke go by the window.
How you in Roger, flight over. Port recovery. Flight range safety, we're through the gates. Roger. Pico, caps up. Other grades fired. Go indicated from Burroughs. Let it go from Burroughs. Roger, stand by. Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around.
John Glenn reports 0G, and I feel fine. He says the view is tremendous.
Almost cut off. Roger, 7. You have a go. At least 7 orbits.
Oh, that view is tremendous.
He can see a very large cloud pattern clear back toward Cape Canaveral and says it's a beautiful sight.
Especially to have behind him, since that could have given us so much trouble, but did not, here at the Cape this morning.
Astronaut John Glenn now reports his spacecraft has turned around. The blunt heat shield is facing the direction of flight and is tilted up about 34 degrees above horizontal. This is the desired pre-planned orbital attitude.
Estimating apogee altitude 138 nautical miles. Roger. Apogee altitude 138.
The critical phase passed. Flight Director Chris Kraft observing every facet of this operation. The spacecraft now passing beyond the first major time of decision.
The Friendship 7 spacecraft, its pilot John Glenn, is now in contact with Bermuda. This is Mercury Control.
The Mercury capsule separates, and Glenn begins coasting. Radar stations in Bermuda calculate his trajectory and confirm. Friendship 7 has made orbit. How many orbits Glenn can make is not planned in advance. The radar data from Bermuda indicates that the trajectory would be healthy for at least 7 orbits, but the mileage of the spacecraft had not yet been proven. NASA does not know precisely how the spacecraft will age over time. Thus, the mission will progress 1 orbit at a time, each night pass providing an opportunity to review data and the spacecraft's status, determining whether or not the mission should continue.
This is Friendship 7. Have beautiful view of the African coast, both in the scope and out the window. Out the window is by far the best view.
Glenn calmly operates and tests the spacecraft, making minor pitch and yaw adjustments. He notices that the onboard attitude indicators disagree with what he observes to be the true spacecraft attitude. But any minor disappointment in the hardware is quickly overshadowed by the view Glenn would enjoy as he passes over the African coastline.
The horizon is a brilliant blue. There, I have the mainland in sight at present time, coming up on the scope, and have canaries in sight out through the window, and picked them up on the scope just before I saw them out the window. All systems are still go, having no problems at all. Control system operating fine. Over. So this is Friendship 7 still on ASCS. I can see dust storms down there blowing across the desert. A lot of dust. It's difficult to see the ground in some areas. Over.
Oceans, continents, nations at a glance. Glenn is the first American to enjoy the grandeur of Earth from orbit. He watches his first sunset in space as Friendship 7 coasts on over the Indian Ocean. He starts taking pictures with a Minolta Hi-Matic 35mm film camera that he purchased from a drugstore prior to the flight, having convinced NASA to let him take the camera into space.
This is Friendship 7. Had a beautiful sunset, and can see the light way out almost up to the northern horizon. The sunset was beautiful. It went down very rapidly. I still have a brilliant blue band clear across the horizon, almost covering my whole window. The redness of the sunset I can still see through some of the clouds way over to the left of my course. Over. The sky above is absolutely black, completely black. I can see stars, though, up above. I do not have any of the constellations identified as yet. Over.
As day breaks over Canton Island in the Pacific, Glenn saw that the spacecraft is surrounded by thousands of brilliant lights. His first impression was that the spacecraft is tumbling, or that perhaps he was looking into a star field, but a quick hard look at the horizon showed that Friendship 7 was stable. As Friendship 7 sped over the Pacific into brighter sunlight, these fireflies disappear.
That was sure a short day. Again, Friendship 7? That was about the shortest day I've ever run into. Time passes rapidly, huh? Yes, sir. This is Friendship 7. I'll try to describe what I'm in here. I'm in a big mass of some very small particles that are brilliantly lit up like they're luminescent. I never saw anything like it. They're coming by the capsule, and they look like little stars, a whole shower of them coming by. They swirl around the capsule and go in front of the window, and they're all brilliantly lighted. They probably average maybe 7 or 8 feet apart, but I can see them all down below me also. They do have a different motion though from me, because they swirl around the capsule and then depart back the way that I am looking. Are you receiving? Over. There are literally thousands of them. This is Friendship 7. Am I in contact with anyone? Over. This has been going on since about 1+15. Over. Just after I remarked about the sunset, I looked back up and looked out the window, and all the little swirl of particles was going by. Over.
Flight Capcom. Flight Capcom. Do you see any real problem in letting it go until we lose AC on the fans bus?
No one on the ground has any idea what they could be. While the initial impression was that they did not seem to be originating from the spacecraft, a quick bang on the capsule wall produced more of these so-called fireflies. It must therefore have been ice crystals, forming from water vapor that was venting from onboard systems. Glenn starts to notice a developing problem. A sticky RCS valve, exactly the kind of issue that had plagued Enos's flight aboard MA5. Glenn immediately starts to troubleshoot the situation, attempting to prove once and for all that the flexibility of man can augment the reliability of machine.
Roger, this is Friendship 7. I'm going on fly-by-wire so I can control more accurately. It just started as I got to Wymus, and appears to be, it drifts off in yaw to the right at about 1 degree per second. It will go over to an attitude of about 20 degrees and hold at that, and when it hits about a 20 degree point, it then goes into orientation mode and comes back to zero, and it was cycling back and forth in that mode. I am on fly-by-wire now and controlling manually, over.
The onboard automatic stabilization and control system is allowing the spacecraft to drift 1.5 degrees per second to the right. This drift initiates a signal in the computer system for an impulse to yaw left, but the RCS control system does not oblige this signal. Glenn switches to manual fly-by-wire and places Friendship 7 back in the correct attitude. Then, switching between the control modes, he determines how to maintain the correct position while incurring the least cost in onboard fuel. The Mercury spacecraft has 4 basic attitude control modes, which can be used singly or in various combinations. These modes also utilize different sets of RCS thrusters on the spacecraft. There are 2 completely independent RCS systems on the Mercury capsule. The automatic system, using a pair of high and a pair of low torque reaction jets for each axis, and the manual system, with a single set of proportional reaction jets. Each of these systems has its own fuel supply and are therefore completely redundant. The automatic stabilization and control mode, which is currently failing Glenn, attempts to hold attitude automatically and uses the automatic control jets. The manual proportional mode locks out the high-torque jets of the automatic system and slews the spacecraft with the smaller, proportional 1-pound RCS jets. This mode uses mechanical linkages to solenoid valves, and while it uses an extravagant amount of fuel and is not precise, it is the emergency method of control in the event of a power failure. A second manual mode, known as fly-by-wire, allows the astronaut to manually operate the automatic system of jets with electronic signals sent from the hand controller. It is the most versatile and popular of the manual control systems, and it is the solution which Glenn chooses for this specific problem. Finally, a third manual mode, called Rate Command, is essentially a fly-by-wire system superimposed onto the manual RCS jets. The astronaut may be able to precisely move the capsule while only using manual system fuel in this mode. It is generally saved until re-entry. Glenn flies the spacecraft in the manual fly-by-wire system for the remainder of the flight. As Friendship 7 crosses over Cape Canaveral at the start of its second orbit, Flight Systems Controller Don Arabian notifies Flight Director Chris Kraft that he is seeing an indication called Segment 51. Segment 51 is the landing bag signal. The warning light is indicating that the landing bag, which is located underneath the heat shield, has deployed. The rubberized landing bag is designed to soften the blow upon impact with the water. If the signal is correct, the implication is that the heat shield may be loose. If so, John Glenn will have no protection against the 3,000-degree entry temperatures. Mercury Control scrambles to address the problem.
Say that over again now. I'm not sure I'm with you, Capcom.
Well, we had a valid segment 51 as we went over here.
Which is what?
Indicating the landing bag is down. It's probably a failure of malfunction of the micro switch. We had it valid here, and we also had it valid over at the hangar on TM.
The mood inside changes dramatically. Meanwhile, Glenn floats above and continues making observations on everything from his spacesuit temperature to the view outside.
Head movements cause no nausea or no bad feelings at all. I am surprised that I can look as close to the sun as I can. The sun is shining directly on my face at present time, and all I have to do is just shade my eyes with my eyebrows.
Mercury Control instructs astronaut Gordon Cooper to query John on the position of the landing bag switch. But they also instruct Gordo not to tell John why. Inside Mercury Control, top brass starts filing in to address the problem.
That whose people's lives depend upon you making good decisions and the correct ones.
Max Faget, the designer, suggests that the straps of the retro rocket package may be the only thing holding the heat shield in place, and if so, it should be left on during re-entry rather than jettisoned prior, as is the normal procedure.
I can show you on a diagram. It's a little hard to explain, but basically it's more indicative that the heat shield limit switch is malfunctioned and the landing bag deploy relays haven't momentarily, mechanically malfunctioned.
Why don't you come out and talk? Wait, stand by one.
Come in, carrier is on.
Here you are, John.
Roger.
There's an indication right there. I think we're sure that it's the limit. The one thing that
you'd think the straps would hold the thing on, though, Ed. The retro straps.
That's Roger. They would hold it on. There's no question about it.
Right.
But if the...
Go ahead, Kickflip. We want the astronaut to put the switch in the auto position. In the auto position, if he gets a red light indicating that the bag has been deployed, then we want him to re-enter with the pack on.
No one knows what the aerodynamic effects are of keeping the package attached. No one knows if they have sufficient control authority with the attitude jets to keep the spacecraft oriented in such a scenario. No one knows whether or not keeping the package attached would cause physical damage to the heat shield. NASA was now operating well outside the bounds of their design knowledge. They had entered uncharted waters. Chris Kraft recognizes that the indication comes from a single sensor. It cannot be verified by a different system, and may be a phantom signal altogether. With only a single data point, the discussion on the ground is at an impasse. Glenn orbits on, blissfully unaware of the panicked situation on the ground. However, he becomes suspicious when site after site consecutively asks him to ensure that his landing bag deploy switch is off.
Roger, did someone report landing bag could be down? Over.
Negative. We had a request to monitor this and to ask you if you heard any flapping when you had high capsule rates.
Negative.
This was over.
Well, I think they probably thought these particles I saw might have come from that. But there are thousands of these things, and they go out for, it looks like miles in each direction from me, and they move by here very slowly.
The operations team conclude that retaining the retro pack is the only possible way, and with the blessing of the designer, Faget, choose this as the course forward. Tracking Station Hawaii tells Glenn to place the landing bag deploy switch in the automatic position, and then report whether or not a light comes on. From this query, Glenn mentally deduces what the situation is. Wally Schirra, in California, communicates to Glenn that the retro pack would have to be left on during re-entry. Glenn gently presses him to admit why, but he doesn't push it. Glenn knows what the problem is, but he also knows people are listening. Glenn is frustrated that Mission Control are not being entirely honest with him as to the situation of his own spacecraft. In Glenn's judgment, the astronaut should be kept fully informed of all possible issues, lest they lose communication with the ground.
This is Capcom President 7. We are recommending that you leave the retro package on through the entire re-entry. This means that you will have to override the 05G switch, which is expected to occur at 0443. This also means that you will have to manually retract the scope. Do you read?
This is Friendship 7. What is the reason for this? Do you have any reason? Over.
Not at this time. This is the judgment of Cape Flight.
Roger. Say again your instructions, please. Over.
After just 3 orbits, it is decided to initiate retrofire. After just 3 orbits, Glenn is coming home.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
Roger. Retros are firing.
Yeah, baby.
Are they ever? It feels like I'm going back toward Hawaii. Roger, fire retro light is green. Roger. Roger, retros have stopped.
4.5 hours into flight, Friendship 7 fires its retro package and breaks out of Earth orbit. There was no turning back now. Glenn was headed for a rendezvous with the atmosphere. He would either slow down or burn up. Glenn starts to hear noises that he describes as small things brushing against the capsule. The orbital re-entry does not impart the high G-loads of the ballistic flights. Its trajectory is much more depressed, and the spacecraft remains in the high atmosphere for quite a bit longer. But it does impart much higher peak temperatures. Glenn experiences his worst emotional stress of the flight as he watches burning chunks fly by his window. Likely pieces of the retro pack. Or were they pieces of his heat shield?
This is Friendship 7. I think the pack just let go. This is Friendship 7. A real fireball outside.
Friendship 7, this is Gabe. Over. All 3 of them. Right. Roger. Friendship 7, this is Gabe. Over.
Okay, Friendship 7, over. Okay, Friendship 7, over. Okay, Friendship 7, do you receive, over? I'm getting all kinds of contrails and stuff outside out here. My condition is good, but that was a real fireball, boy. I had great chunks of that retro pack breaking off all the way through.
Very good. It did break off. Is that correct?
Roger. Altimeter off the peg indicating 80,000.
Roger. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger.
Seven, this is Steve. As you read, you will be within 1 mile of the uprange destroyer. Recovery weather is very good. Over.
Roger, understand. 5,000, stand by. Mark.
The destroyer has the capsule parachute in sight. They are talking. Roger. Did you copy that?
Friendship 7 breaks scattered cloud cover and descends through 5,000 feet, 40 miles short of its planned landing site, but nonetheless within visible range of the U.S. Navy destroyer, Noah. The cause for the landing bag signal, a microswitch malfunction. The heat shield was never loose. America's first foray into orbital flight had been a blend of awe and chaos. Nobody could have predicted the problems encountered, yet the system triumphed. America was back in the game. John Glenn becomes the kind of old-fashioned, star-spangled hero that NASA needs. A very public face to a struggling space program. It was a turning point. An unfortunate side effect of this is that Glenn would not be considered for future space flights, much to his own disappointment. After coming so close, NASA dared not risk losing him again. He would now serve as a liaison to the public, a PR man. Glenn would eventually serve 25 years in the United States Senate, and would, after all, fly into space again, on the shuttle in 1998. The next flight, much like Liberty Bell 7, would have to prove that the Mercury capsule was capable of reliable operation. That flight is given to astronaut Deke Slayton and his ship, Delta 7. Donald Kent Slayton is a pilot's pilot. He flew tactical bombers in the Second World War, and learned to traverse the skies when doing so was more of an art and less of a science. Like many of the other Mercury astronauts, he drinks and smokes. Unlike the other astronauts, however, Deke Slayton suffers from cardiac dysrhythmia, which was apparently not detected during his application and medical testing. It is detected prior to the launch of Mercury Atlas 7, when Slayton is training in a centrifuge, and further testing leads to a diagnosis of idiopathic atrial fibrillation. Though he is deemed healthy enough to fly aircraft, NASA Administrator James Webb leads an internal investigation which ultimately disqualifies him for the flight. He is replaced by Scott Carpenter, who served as Glenn's backup for the MA6 mission. Deke starts exercising more regularly and abstains from drinking alcohol, but he won't get a chance to fly into space for another decade and a half. During this time, he serves as a senior manager of the astronaut office, and is ultimately given the responsibility for making crew assignments and selections. It is because of Deke Slayton that Neil Armstrong is the first man to set foot on the moon. Scott Carpenter renames the capsule to Aurora 7, and after a flawless countdown, absent from delays or technical issues, he rides the fire into the wild blue yonder on May 24th, 1962.
Locks tanking. Water systems. Go. Range operations. Oh, you're clear along. Mercury cap. Go. All restart lights are correct. Range ready light is on. 26. Eject Mercury embellish.
Retract light. Delico's out. Scope is in. Light is out.
Scope on. Understand. Scope is in.
Get Roger.
Only momentarily 19 seconds.
Understand.
We're on the count. 15. 10. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I feel the liftoff. The clock has started.
Roger.
Out and clear, Gus.
Roger. Stand by for attack.
Roger. Little bit of shaking. Very smooth.
3, 2, 1, lock.
Roger. The backup clock has started.
Roger.
Clear blue sky. 32 seconds. 9,000. Fuel and oxygen steady. Cabin pressure 15.1 and dropping. A little rough through max Q at 1 minute.
Roger, you're looking good from here.
Okay, 25 amps and the power is good.
Roger, you're looking good.
All the power is good.
Roger, pitch is 56, you're looking.
Roger, my pitch looks good. It's smoothing down a little bit now. I feel the pitch program starting over. Roger. The sky is getting quite black at 1:30. Elapsed. Fuel and oxygen is steady. Cabin pressure is leveling off at 6.2. Roger, there's Pico on time. And
Roger, understand, Pico.
Roger, I felt staging. Do you confirm?
Staging.
Do you confirm staging?
7, we confirm staging.
Okay. There is Pico. Deposit grade's fired. I am weightless.
Roger, you look good down here.
Periscope is out. And
have it go with more than 7 hour capability.
Roger, sweet words.
Roger.
Sometime, oh, look at that sun. Red at this time, oh, man. A wide, a beautiful, beautiful ring like in John's pictures. Going to fly-by-wire. I am now photographing large cloud banks. What in the world happened to the periscope? Oh, it's dark. That's what happened. It's facing a dark Earth. It's quite dark. I didn't begin to get time to dark adapt. I have the fireflies. Hello, Glamis. Erroneous. I have the particle. Some even appear to be going ahead. There is one outside. Almost like a light snowflake particle caught in an eddy. They are not glowing with their own light at this time.
Carpenter enters orbit without a hitch. Glenn's flight had proven that an astronaut would in fact be able to function in zero-G. Carpenter would build on that experience. The mission of Aurora 7 is jam-packed with attitude maneuvers, zero-G experiments, and observation exercises. Carpenter's flight plan is expanded to permit him to use maneuvering fuel at his own discretion, and use it he does. Carpenter has been described as a romantic. He is fascinated by the beauty of space and goes to great lengths to capture the finer details of spaceflight. Like Glenn, he observes the firefly phenomena, and also notices that the spacecraft's onboard instruments do not necessarily agree with where it is pointed. Carpenter tests several types of space food prepared for the flight by the Pillsbury Company. Bars composed of chocolate, figs, and dates with high-protein cereal. The Nestle Company provides bonbons composed of orange peel and almonds. Carpenter finds them crumbly and bothersome. On the start of his second orbit, Carpenter begins aggressively maneuvering his spacecraft to make observations. He pitches down 80 degrees over Woomera. He yaws around another 50 degrees to observe air glow. He rolls the capsule until the Earth is directly above his window. On 6 separate occasions, he accidentally actuated the high-thrust RCS jets of the automatic system. He was now eating through both systems' fuel supplies. By the end of the first 2 orbits, Aurora 7's RCS propellants had dropped to 42% in the manual system and 45% in the automatic system. Tracking stations repeatedly remind him to conserve his fuel. Carpenter conducts a small internal experiment into microgravity. He observes the behavior of liquid in a weightless state inside a closed glass bottle. He also conducts an external experiment, deploying a multicolored balloon into space. The movement of the half-inflated balloon was erratic and unpredictable, but he managed to obtain a few drag resistance measurements. He also attempts to hold a steady attitude by centering the moon in his window. Glenn had reported some difficulty in obtaining and holding an absolute heading, likely due to his sticky RCS thruster. Carpenter, however, is able to hold the moon on the exact center mark and maintain the position with ease. Carpenter also finds that he is able to reproduce the fireflies by tapping against the capsule hatch. It is decided to bring Aurora 7 home after 3 orbits. Everything had gone successfully, but the spacecraft was dangerously low on fuel. In preparing for retrofire, Carpenter begins to make several critical errors. Passing over Hawaii, Carpenter states that he is somewhat behind on the pre-retro checklist while verifying his hypothesis about the snowflake-like particles outside his window. As he begins aligning the spacecraft into retrograde attitude, he finds that, like in Glenn's case, the automatic stabilization system will not hold the correct heading. As he tries to troubleshoot the situation, he falls even further behind schedule.
General Kraft is still somewhat concerned about auto fuel. Use no auto fuel unless you have to prior to retro sequence time.
I am looking down almost vertically. It's possible to distinguish, I believe, 4 separate cloud layers.
Understand. Aurora 7, can we get over the checklist? We have approximately 3 minutes left of contact.
Hi, Roger. Go ahead with the checklist, and I'm coming to retro attitude now. And my control mode is automatic.
And fortunately, we had Alan Shepard in California that could talk him into doing the retrofire and getting into the position to fire the retro rockets. He had floundered and gotten rid of all of his propellant, messing around with the spacecraft. He was using the controls, both automatic and manual, and almost run out of fuel. And when he came up on Hawaii, and when he was supposed to be in retrofire attitude, that is the right attitude to fire his rockets, he was turned the wrong way. And it was touch and go, and I think Mr. Shepard should get the credit for talking him into the right attitude and giving him the directions as to how to fire the rockets manually, which he did. And he was late in firing them, and he was at the wrong angle when he fired the rockets, so that extended his time at high G during entry. He got up to about 12 G, when normal entry was around 9, which is very high anyway.
Stand by. Wait a minute. I have a problem in I have an ASCS problem here. I think ASCS is not operating properly. Attitudes do not agree. 5 minutes to retrograde light is on. I have a rate of descent, too, of about 12 feet per second.
Aurora 7 is traveling at nearly 5 miles every second. Being even slightly off in timing or heading would translate to huge errors downrange. For 10 minutes, fuel from both systems is being used redundantly as Carpenter wrestles control away from the automatic system and hurriedly switches to the fly-by-wire control mode. Carpenter would have to push the button to ignite the solid fuel retro rockets manually and physically hold the correct attitude through the burn. At some point throughout this process, Carpenter becomes disoriented and loses track of what his heading is. When retrofire does come, it comes 3 seconds late and 25 degrees in the wrong direction.
Retro sequence is green.
All right, Roger. Check ASCS quickly to see if orientation mode will hold.
you'll have to use attitude bypass, man, and manual override.
Roger.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Okay, fire 1, fire 2, and fire 3. I had to punch off manually. I have a little bit of smoke in the capsule.
That 2-0, Scotty.
Okay, I think they held well, Al. I think they were good. I can't tell you what was wrong about them because the gyros were not quite right. But retro jettison, 3 fuse switches are on.
All right, we should have retro jettison in about 10 seconds.
Roger. That was a nice gentle bump. All 3 have fired. Retro attitude was a red.
All right, we should have retro jettison now.
Right then, at 34:10 on time.
All right, Roger. How much fuel do you have left, both tanks?
I have 20 and 5.
Roger. I guess we better use...
I'll use manual.
On re-entry, unless ASCS holds you in re-entry attitude.
Yes, it can. I'll have to do it with manual.
By the time retrofire is completed, Scott Carpenter is out of manual RCS fuel, and his automatic system is down to 25%. Aurora 7 did manage to break orbit, but it's now heading for a splashdown point 200 nautical miles off target. During re-entry, he uses small spurts of whatever fuel he has left to maintain a slow roll and attitude stability throughout the descent. Somewhere between 80 and 70,000 feet of altitude, Aurora 7 runs out of RCS propellant entirely.
We're at 6.5 Gs. Star holding to within 1.5 degrees per second, indicating about 10 degrees per second roll, right?
Aurora 7 splashes down hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest ship. When Carpenter fails to raise a response by radio, he decides to leave his spacecraft. Opting to exfil through the auxiliary egress hatch at the top of the vehicle rather than through the primary side hatch, Carpenter inflates his life raft and crawls out into the ocean. It would be 1 hour and 7 minutes until Carpenter would be reached by recovery forces, who came upon him eating a candy bar and enjoying the view of the ocean. When he was picked up, he is quoted as saying, "I didn't know where I was, and Mission Control didn't either." This phrase, combined with his nonchalant attitude about the situation, enrages certain individuals in Mission Control, including Flight Director Chris Kraft. Because of this experience, Carpenter is blacklisted from future space flights. He will never fly into space again. By this time, both the United States and the Soviet Union had flown 2 orbital missions. The Soviet second mission, Vostok 2, had stayed in space for just over a day, with cosmonaut German Titov making over 17 orbits. It soon becomes clear that flight duration would be the first contest in the long march to the moon. With duration as the new goal, Mercury Control is keen to avoid astronauts like Scott Carpenter, who liberally burned through his fuel. The pilot for the next mission, Mercury Atlas 8, would have to be Carpenter's opposite, someone who was strictly business and had little time for, quote, Mickey Mousing. They found their man in Wally Schirra. His flight, nicknamed Sigma 7, would not be scientific in nature, but rather a strictly engineering checkout on the durability of the Mercury spacecraft in orbit. Wally wants to fly the perfect mission. He cuts out any activity in the flight plan that he deems unnecessary. He approaches his mission with a test pilot's mind. Sigma 7 is aiming to double the duration of the previous missions, and will attempt to make 6 orbits of the Earth instead of 3. Wally also fancies himself an avid photographer and purchases an expensive Swedish-manufactured Hasselblad film camera prior to the flight. The results impress NASA so much that Hasselblads become the camera of choice for future spaceflights. Just 2 months prior to MA-8, the USSR launches the Vostok 3 and Vostok 4 missions in intersecting orbits. The cosmonauts on board are able to see each other in space, and while it isn't strictly a rendezvous, it was close enough to make NASA nervous. What's more, the 2 missions complete 64 and 48 orbits respectively, just under 4 and 3 days, landing within a few minutes of each other on August 15th. This is far ahead of anything planned for Mercury. The Soviet Union had, once again, asserted its dominance in space. But for Wally, the countdown continues, and he flies the Atlas into orbit on October 3rd, 1962.
Standing by for tower, fuel looks good, oxygen looks good. Right, fine. Okay, I'm gonna push the torque and the sun's coming in the window now. Okay, there goes the tower. The tower really is a sign on. Hi, it'll be cool. Oh, I can see the flash. Alright, you have a go from control center. Roger, you have a go from me and it's real fast. Alright, you have a go from here. Roger, it looks real good. Are you a turtle today? Going to box record only. You bet your sweet ass I am. What time to get you on that one? Okay, I finished box record.
During the boost phase, Capcom Deke Slayton pops Wally an interesting question. The Ancient and Honorable Order of Turtles is an inside joke between World War II pilots. Self-described as an honorable drinking fraternity composed of ladies and gentlemen of the highest morals and good character, when a group of turtles are gathered in a social function, it is customary for the question to be asked, "Are you a turtle today?" The correct reply being, "You bet your sweet ass I am." If the member is unable or unwilling to provide the correct answer immediately, perhaps because of a social restriction on vulgarity, say at a wedding or while flying into space while hundreds of thousands are listening, the member owes to each turtle present a drink of the recipient's choice. Wally does not utter his answer on the air, but rather speaks it into an onboard tape recorder which he produces after the flight. After separating from the Atlas booster, Schirra slowly cartwheels into the correct attitude. He deliberately keeps the motion of the spacecraft slow to conserve fuel. The sustainer engine on the Atlas rocket had continued burning 10 seconds longer than planned, sending Wally higher and faster than any other astronaut had gone or would go during Project Mercury.
Okay, as you can see, I'm yard right again. I need to come, correction, yard left. I need to come right. The moon is right on the horizon. I'll put it right in again just to show you how easy it is to record. Oh, I've got some lights down there. How about that? I got a washer in here. I captured a washer and a little piece of little metal. And this looks like sort of a conical washer, like a horseshoe type or something. Better not be.
As on each of the previous two missions, several stations on the ground fire flares into the sky as the spacecraft passes overhead. And, like on each of the previous flights, the pilot is not able to observe them. Despite mild overheating in his suit, everything was going swimmingly. By the end of the first orbit, he had only used 1.5 pounds of fuel. He is not struck by the beauty of space, as Glenn or Carpenter had been. He continues diligently working in his tasks, spending most of the time looking at his instruments, rather than looking out the window.
Getting the sunlight in view again, and we should be in the proper yaw angle approximately, because that's where the sun would be. Sunset coming up on 5 hours, so I'll begin preparing to copy the intermediate report at this time.
He consumes yet more experimental space food. This time, peaches and ground beef mush out of squeeze tubes. Shiraz spends a lot of his time drifting, with the RCS system turned off, simply letting the spacecraft coast on uncontrolled. He laments the fact that, for most of the flight, many of the Earth observation sites are covered in clouds. On the sixth and final orbit, Sigma 7 comes within range of the Pacific Command ship. A mission that had lasted twice as long as Aurora 7. Shiraz still has 78% of his fuel left in both systems. 8 hours and 52 minutes after Sigma 7 lifted off from the Cape, Wally Schirra makes a perfect retrofire. He remains on the automatic stabilization system throughout the burn, and is surprised to see that the spacecraft maintains perfect attitude throughout the boost. A quick glance at his RCS fuels after the burn shows that the automatic fuel system had dropped to 52% in the process. At the request of the engineers, Schirra remains on automatic control during re-entry. He watches as the hydrogen peroxide fuel is hungrily consumed as the spacecraft fights the aerodynamic forces of the upper atmosphere.
That she's holding real tight. Very tight. I got 2. The other 2s are right on the money. I got 3. And I have a roll rate started. A slight pitch rate. Not bad at all. I can see out the window for some strange reason at last. And the attitude looks very stable. I'm rolling right around the horizon. I can see the ion layer. I'm inverted at this time. Heading up to 5.5 G. In command still holding. Heading up to 6.5 G. 7 G. Coming up to 8 G. Big command holding. And the drogue is out. You can hear. I can't see her because of the clouds. Attitudes are holding well. And your lever is in. RCS fuel is going pretty fast. I can see the drogue now. Drogue looks very good. I'm going arc stab to actually I don't need it. Big command is burning itself out. And the arc stab is doing nothing, just sitting there. I'll put her in auto mode just to let her pump out. Standing by, recovery arm is on. Standing by for main chute. All switches in proper position. Counting fuel is almost all gone. There goes Rogue, and main is out. Oh, she's out beautiful. Nice blue sky. Main is de-reefed, and looks like a sweetie pie. Auto fuel is dumping. Rate of descent is about 35 at this time. I see no problems at all.
After 9 hours and 13 minutes of flight, Sigma 7 splashes down half a mile from the USS Kearsarge, in full view of the crew and onboard cameras. It had been a perfect splashdown following a perfect mission. Within 40 minutes of hitting the water, Schirra was standing on the deck of the carrier. It was the first splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, just off Midway Island. Sigma 7 was the most successful Mercury mission to date, and may have been more memorable, if not for the news event that would shock the world just 2 weeks after the mission's conclusion. On October 15th, 1962, U-2 spy plane overflights of Cuba confirmed the worst. The deployment of offensive Soviet R-7 Semyorka ICBMs in the Western Hemisphere. The following international stalemate and naval quarantine comes to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, during which time the entire space program is shut down as Atlas missiles across the country, the same kind that are propelling Mercury astronauts into orbit, are armed with nuclear warheads and prepare to fly towards their targets inside Russia. It is the closest America has ever come to nuclear war.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. The size of this undertaking makes clear that it has been planned for some months. Nuclear weapons are so destructive, and ballistic missiles are so square, that any substantially increased possibility of their use, or any sudden change in their deployment, may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union.
Everyone by then, even those in the space program, had forgotten that, despite the bliss and grandeur of making mankind's first explorations of the heavens above, those explorations were being made on weapons systems which also make possible the absolute destruction of the modern world. The implications were very, very real, and the terrifying true nature of this possibility is laid bare during a few weeks in October 1962. A flashpoint that fizzles. America's military returns home from a war that never happened. The ICBMs of the United States and the Soviet Union across the world, the harbingers of mutually assured destruction, stand down for now.
Well, I didn't know how worried I was looking. I was worried. There was no question about that. And until I saw the tape of the press conference, I didn't realize how worried I was.
The success of Mercury Atlas 8 and the twin flights of Vostok 3 and 4 had been a death knell for Mercury. The project had brought much success, but NASA couldn't keep doing the same old thing for long. It was time to think bigger. And Kennedy's moon speech at Rice University in Texas sends a clear message to everyone. It's time to think bigger and move faster. Mercury Atlas 10, a flight which was originally assigned to Alan Shepard, is canceled. The next flight, MA9, would be Mercury's last, as NASA rapidly prepares the new two-man Gemini capsule and builds a brand new mission control center in Houston, Texas.
Business of space operations involves very high risk. And the tools that we use are leadership, trust, teamwork, and values. And the people who implement these tools, use these tools to implement the missions, are the men and women of mission control. You have to establish a frame of mind that is absolutely positive, one that cannot be defeated. And the best way to express that I will never surrender attitude is failure is not an option.
MA-9 would be given to the only astronaut who hadn't yet flown and was still qualified to fly, Gordo Cooper. His mission, like Glenn's, would be open-ended. Using the experience gained from Sigma 7, Gordo would attempt to push the Mercury capsule to its limits, aiming to stay in orbit for an entire day, and even longer if possible. Gordo ironically nicknames his spacecraft Faith 7 in a snide attempt to show that he was praying the flight would go well. After the first manned Gemini mission, officials at NASA would eventually ban the naming of spacecraft until Apollo in 1969. Changes are made to the hardware based on Wally Schirra's advice. 12 pounds of control equipment, 5 pounds of radio equipment, and a 76-pound periscope are removed. In total, there are 183 alterations made to increase fuel and electricity margins and to extend the life of the spacecraft. Several cameras are also introduced, including a slow-scan television camera that would allow Gordo to broadcast images of himself back down to the ground. For the day-long mission, the capsule Faith 7 weighs over 3,000 pounds, or 1,400 kilograms. Because Faith 7 will orbit nearly every part of the Earth from 32.5 degrees north to 32.5 degrees south, a total of 28 ships, 171 aircraft, and 18,000 servicemen are assigned to support the mission. May 15th, 1963. Gordo Cooper becomes the last American to fly into space alone, atop his lumbering Atlas missile. He flies forward into the unknown.
3, 2, 1. Roger, and lift off, and the clock is operating. Sigma 7, Faith 7 on the way. Standing by to start the backup clock. Roger. 3, 2, 1. Roger, and the backup clock is running. Roger, you look good here, Doyle. Roger, feel good, buddy. Good sport. 30 seconds and fuel is go. Oxygen is go. Cabin pressure on the top fairing altimeter is working. Roger, you're looking beautiful. What an afterburner. That's the beauty. Your clocks are in sync. 1 minute and fuel is go. Oxygen is go. Cabin pressure 10 psi on schedule. All systems go. Roger, we have a good go here and pitch 50. Roger, 1 minute, 30 seconds. Fuel is go. Oxygen is go. Cabin pressure 6 psi. Roger, pitch 32 looks good. Roger. Sun is coming in the window, yeah? Roger, we're standing by for your Pico. Roger, your Pico. Roger, your Pico. Confirm staging. You feel staging. We're good on Pico time. Pico should be nominal. Roger. Go to the tower. Roger, confirm your tower. Roger, retro Jensen switch off. Retro Jensen switch off. You look real pretty here. She's not real pretty.
From what we can overhear in this conversation, as amateurs on the ground, everything was going perfectly and dead on schedule.
Step cap green, Seco, I'm on aux stamp. Going fly by wire. Everything is green here. Phase 7, this is Canary Capcom. Roger, Canary Capcom, Phase 7, reading you loud and clear.
As astronaut Cooper finished his first orbit of the Earth about 90 minutes after takeoff, it was obvious all was going well. Now came the time to decide how many trips he would make as his first goal. That decision was announced by Colonel John Powers, Information Officer for Project Mercury.
Cooper's mission is a blend of Carpenter's and Schirra's. He spends most of the time drifting, not using any fuel, but his flight plan is jam-packed with experiments, measuring everything from radiation to propellant slosh. Between orbits 9 and 13, he enters a rest period after a dinner of powdered roast beef mush and water. He admittedly isn't sleepy and spends most of the time taking pictures.
This is a new and strange environment at first, this suddenly finding yourself in orbit, and want to take a few seconds time to think about this and see just what you're doing up here. It takes you a few minutes to really settle down. The added distraction is that there is the Earth in view out of the window. It is a tremendous distraction. You want to glue your eyes on the window and watch every little detail of everything that's going on there.
By his 14th orbit, Cooper reports sufficient oxygen supplies, 69% automatic fuel, and 95% manual fuel. He is able to get an hour of sound sleep during the flight, and also transmits the first American television images from space.
I would like to take this time to say a little prayer for all the people. Thank you for the privilege of being able to be in this position, be up in this wondrous place, seeing all these startling, wondrous things that you've created. Be with all our families. Let them know that everything will be okay. We ask you in thy name. Amen.
15 minutes before sunset, Major Cooper prepared to eject this sphere or beacon for another experiment, to find out how well man can see flashing lights in space to help with rendezvous and docking maneuvers in future space programs. Orbits 15, 16, 17, 18. 18 times around the Earth. The first of a series of tests were begun to measure radiation in space, where a belt of fission electrons trapped in the lower regions of the Earth's magnetic field would be penetrated by Faith 7 on orbits passing over eastern South America and the South Atlantic Ocean. Primarily, the measurements were made by two Geiger counters located on the retropack. One of the Geiger counters surveyed a hemisphere-shaped area unobstructed by the spacecraft and unaffected by radiation scattered by its structure. The other registered radiation directly in the path of travel. Trapped electrons spiraling along the Earth's magnetic flux lines were primarily the source of radiation.
It was now nearing 30 hours since liftoff. On the 19th orbit, the condition of Faith 7 begins deteriorating. It starts, innocuously enough, as a false indication. The 0.05 G light comes on, indicating that the vehicle is starting to decelerate. The reading is faulty, as Faith 7 is still drifting weightlessly in orbit. Just half an hour later, Cooper loses all attitude readings. On the next orbit, a short circuit occurs in the bus bar serving the 250-volt main inverter. This leaves the automatic stabilization and control system without electrical power. The spacecraft had lost its onboard computer. It is then decided that Faith 7 should return home. At the end of the 21st orbit, preparations are made for retrofire. When the ASCS inverter blew out, Cooper also noted that the carbon dioxide level was rising in both his suit and cabin. The calm and collected Cooper continues diligently working in his tasks as systems around him begin to fail. Faith 7 is dying. Like Carpenter, Cooper has to conduct retrofire manually. Unlike Carpenter, Cooper's manual retrofire is accurate to a T. 3, 2, 1,
fire. Roger, a green on air. Roger, I think I got all three. Roger, how's your attitude holding, Gordo? Well, pretty fine. Good show, boys, real fine. It looks like they came off right on the money on time. Roger, I think so.
Faith 7 splashes down just 4.5 kilometers from the carrier in the waters of the Blue Pacific. The fact that Cooper, like Glenn, had to take action in the midst of a failing spacecraft added luster and glory to the perception of his flight. He is treated to the same massive ticker tape parades and hoopla of his predecessors, Shepard and Glenn. He is also found to be dehydrated and suffering from orthostatic hypotension. He had lost 7 pounds. Physicians are cautious about the implications of this for even longer space missions. The Mercury program had fulfilled all of its goals. In the process, The world had been transformed. Spaceflight was no longer a fruitless backwater pursued by old German weapon engineers and starry-eyed comic book readers. It now was the Cold War. It was the new theater upon which the technological prowess of the two most powerful nations in Earth's history would be decided. But the president that had made it all possible would not even live to see the first American two-man flight into space. John F. Kennedy would fall to an assassin's bullet on November 22, 1963, just days after touring the new space complex being built to facilitate the launch of a huge new family of rockets called Saturn. In the meantime, the upcoming Project Gemini would either make or break America's march to the moon.